Notes video for Tuesday, September 28th. This is only 2 videos. This is number 2. The first thing we're going to look at is the Missouri Compromise. Now, while things, seem all peachy keen in the country, it's not truly so because you have issues like the Missouri Compromise. This is, and you want to make sure you get this down, the Missouri Compromise is one of the major stepping stones towards the Civil War. It's one of the first big milestones that shows there's some issues with the regions developing since we've come together as a country. So, in 1819, Missouri applies for statehood, and slavery begins to enter the national debate because now you have another state who wants to enter into the country. This is the first territory that would become a state that was in the Louisiana Purchase territory. So if you look at that top right map, you can see Missouri is in the Louisiana Purchase territory, and now the concern is, should slavery go to that high up north, and should you allow slavery to expand out in the Louisiana Purchase territory? And you can also see that all the southwest area, Texas and all those zones, are not ours yet either. So the concern is, should slavery go out west, and should it go to the Louisiana Purchase territories? So Missouri wants to be a state, and slavery becomes a national issue. After adding multiple states, America had a balance of 11 to 11 states, 11 free states versus 11 slave states. So in 1820, we had exactly enough even states. We had 11 free states and 11 slave states. So there was a suggestion that they should pass an amendment in Congress called the Talmadge Amendment. This does not pass, and it's not something you have to know, but I'm going to spell it for you real quick. Talmadge is spelled T-A-L-L-M-A-D-G-E, Talmadge Amendment, named after a congressman whose last name Talmadge. There was this idea that they should make an amendment to the Constitution that would do a gradual emancipation for any state that developed out west. That basically, if you had a slave state developed out west, you had to, by law, have a gradual emancipation plan in place. And so it failed to pass Congress, but this is the first time you see the first time you see the North try to do something to limit the expansion of slavery. So in this process of debating what should happen, you get the first time the North tries to limit or abolish the expansion of slavery heading out west. Now again, at this point, the North is almost done with slavery in general. They're not trying to abolish slavery everywhere. They're just really into not seeing it expand. And that's the theme up till Civil War, is that the North does not want to see slavery expand. They're not trying to abolish it in general. Most are not trying to abolish it. So what happens is that Henry Clay, who at this point has become a very prominent statesman, who has been both in the House and Senate at this point, decides to get involved here. Henry Clay has also been Speaker of the House as well. He decides to make a compromise. So the Missouri Compromise is Henry Clay's compromise. This was his baby, and it shows his leadership as far as a leader in the Senate and as far as in his party. So here are the parts of the Missouri Compromise. Number one, of course, Missouri would enter as a slave state. So they would add Missouri as a slave state, and number two, Maine would be added in as a free state to keep the balance. So Maine used to be part of Massachusetts. You can kind of see that on the map there, where you have Massachusetts. Maine was a part of Massachusetts going back to colonial times. And so, according to this amendment, Maine now becomes its own state to keep the balance. You get 12 and 12 now. This does not mean that every single time that you add a state in the future, you have to have a balance. There's no law saying that has to happen. This was just a compromise for this period. But it kind of becomes expected that you don't want to offset the balance now. And that's what things are going to get more controversial. As they add more states, it's going to be very upsetting if they offset the balance in Congress with representation, because they don't want the North having too much power in the South and vice versa. The third thing that a compromise does is that it creates what's called the Missouri Compromise line. You can see it there in red on that top map. It's at the 3630 parallel. So it's at the 3630 parallel. It said that nothing above 3630 would become a slave territory, except for Missouri, which is being added during this compromise. So Missouri is an exception, but anything above that line was considered to be only free territory. Now, at this point, it's not a big deal because they're like, we don't have the Southwest yet. We don't have Texas or anything else. But at the time, they thought, okay, this is at least a good compromise and a good deal. Nothing above that line could become slavery. It would just be free. And we'll see how long that lasts. But as of right now, that was their compromise. Americans now being torn between their feelings of nationalism and sectionalism. So while we had the arrogant feelings that people are very gung-ho about, being pro-nationalism, regionalism is becoming a bigger and bigger crisis, and people are now becoming more torn in the arrogant feelings. Still arrogant feelings, but people are more torn about the regionalism in general. The Missouri Compromise did help keep the balance of sectionalism for the next 30 years. So it does help keep a balance of sectionalism and regionalism for the next 30 years until about 1850, which we'll get to that later on in Unit 5. All right, the next thing is the foreign affairs. So we're going to talk about some foreign affairs. In Madison's terms, so going back to Madison, the U.S. Navy, we said, was sent out to deal with the Barbary pirates for the last time. They defeated the Barbary pirates with a better Navy after the War of 1812, better ships, more experienced crews. So the Second Barbary War that took place under Madison and partly under Monroe in the mid-18 teens did finally get rid of all those Barbary pirate issues. Under Monroe, you get one of the most successful, if not the most successful Secretary of State of all time, John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams being the son of former President John Adams. John Quincy Adams was like the dream Secretary of State. He's been an ambassador. He's now going to be Secretary of State for the 8 years under Monroe. He accomplishes a lot during that time period. It makes Monroe look very good as president as a result. And he tries to advance a nationalistic policy, kind of like what Henry Clay did with his economic plan we talked about yesterday. So 3 major treaties he gets accomplished as the Secretary of State. And that's the thing. John Quincy Adams, great Secretary of State, considered to be the best, if top 5 all time. And remember, this is the chief foreign diplomat, but he was not the best president. So the first agreement was the Rush-Bagot Agreement. The Rush-Bagot Agreement, this was between America and Great Britain. This was our first deal between America and Great Britain since the War of 1812 ended with the Treaty of Ghent. This was an arms deal. It limited arms buildup, meaning like Army and Navy buildup along the Great Lakes. Remember, they're still in Canada. The British are still in Canada. This limits an arms buildup around the Great Lakes area. And so it's the first of its kind in U.S. history. It's the first arms limitation agreement or the arms limitation treaty in American history. We'll see a lot more of those during the Cold War down the road. But it shows that America and Great Britain are ready to move past their differences and get along with each other moving forward. And from this point forward, from Rush-Bagot onward to modern day, America and Britain only get stronger and stronger, and we never fall apart again as far as relationship goes. So America and Britain retain our relationship as partners after this, starting with the Rush-Bagot Agreement. The second treaty is the Treaty of 1818. Treaty of 1818, not really original, I know, but Treaty of 1818. This is where British Canada and the United States would share fishing rights along the Great Lakes areas. We also agreed to the joint occupation of Oregon Territory. You can see Oregon out there on that bottom map with the purple. Oregon was a giant area that was occupied by both British and Americans, fishermen, fur trappers, kind of all mixed in that area. Not enough for anybody to claim it for their own. So in which Oregon country at that point was like parts of Idaho, parts of Washington State, parts of Oregon State today, also parts of Canada, as you can kind of see implied by the map. But anyway, so it allowed us to jointly occupy the area together, thus again reinforcing America's relationship with Britain. It also establishes the 49th parallel as our border between Canada and the United States. You can see there the 49th parallel, not into Oregon country, but right there between Oregon country and the Great Lakes, becomes our northern border between us and Canada going forward, which later becomes our official border down the road. And then lastly, the Florida Purchase Treaty. Spain had issues protecting Florida because they never had enough people there, enough soldiers there, so they were getting worried that America might just try to seize it without paying them any kind of money. We've seen Jackson now invaded a few times, attacking Native Americans without authority to do so. So Spain's like, okay, we need to get on this before it becomes too late. So, hang on a second. We already said that Jackson went in and attacked some Seminole villages, and he had killed some Native Americans there. Adams decided to back Jackson and said that his attacks in Florida were legitimate, even though he went there without authority to do so. The Secretary of State says that General Jackson's actions into Florida were approved by the federal government, which makes Spain even more concerned about losing Florida. So, worried that America would take it by force, Spain decides to sell it to us for the best terms they could get. They were also very distracted by Latin America. If you don't know, from 1800 to 1830, Spain's losing colony after colony after colony in Latin America, everything from Mexico down to like Chile and Argentina. They're losing it all right now. So they were worried the U.S. would seize Florida from us, or from the Spanish, so they decided to sell it to us before it was too late. So Adams makes a deal with Spain to get Florida. We also get any kind of claims that Spain may have gotten in Oregon country, so you can kind of see there that Spanish territory runs very high north into Oregon. So basically, they say we're not going to claim anything in Oregon as Spanish. We pay $5 million for Florida, and Spain gives up any claims to Texas areas as well as any claims to Oregon territories as well. But Florida now becomes officially a U.S. territory all the way across to Louisiana now. Okay. And before I go on, I did forget the quote above from Thomas Jefferson. It says, remember, Thomas Jefferson's still alive. Thomas Jefferson's still alive until 1826, 50 years after the Declaration of Independence. So is John Adams. Whenever the Missouri Compromise was written, he had a very famous quote about that, saying, "We have the wolf by the ears, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go." This is referring to slavery. Justice is in one scale, self-preservation is in the other. So he worried the Missouri Compromise was a bad deal because it doesn't really resolve the issue of slavery, even though he's kind of hypocritical, himself owning slaves and dies having slaves, and dies having children in slavery as well too. But we're moving on past that point. All right, the last thing on here is the Monroe Doctrine. This is what most students know about James Monroe, is that he made the Monroe Doctrine, which really wasn't even made by him. It was mostly made by his Secretary of State, your friend John Quincy Adams, who James Monroe gets credit for because John Quincy Adams was all about foreign policy. So after Napoleon was defeated, Europe now had more opportunities to focus on their previous colonies. They had lost a lot of colonies in the Americas, in the Caribbean, in Central and South America, and some might be interested in coming back and reestablish themselves and reclaiming their territories after the 1810s wars with Napoleon. And we didn't want to see these colonies that had become independent or broken away, embracing democracy, embracing republicanism, go back to colonialism. So we're trying to protect those territories in Latin America from becoming colonies again and not being republics or democracies. Britain and the United States did not want Spain to renew their claims and hold Latin America either. So even though Britain was not really in favor of trying to have America have more dominance in Latin America, they didn't want to see Spain reclaim all their territories they're losing at this point. So John Quincy Adams convinced Monroe and his advisors that they should make a deal called the Monroe Doctrine that they would make public very soon without Britain officially backing it. Because he basically said, if we make it, they're going to back us. Like, we're not going to tell them about it, but we're going to make the deal, make our demonstration, and whenever they hear about it, they're basically going to back us up because they're going to have to. So it was a brilliant move by his part. So he believed the British would back them with their navy. So he wanted to act alone without the British knowing in general. So here's the deal. In 1823, in Monroe's presidency, during his annual State of the Union address, Monroe gives a very little quick blurb in his annual address to Congress where he says that Americans, meaning all the Americas, North and South America, the Caribbean, all that, he declared the Americas to be free of any kind of European interference in the future in any republic in the Western Hemisphere. So basically the Monroe Doctrine says that the Americas are free of any European power interfering in any republic in the Western Hemisphere. So this is the Monroe Doctrine, very important for our future foreign policy. Declares that the Americas are free of any European interference or any European power interfering in any republic in the Western Hemisphere. This becomes the cornerstone of American foreign policy. You can write that down. This becomes the cornerstone of American foreign policy, meaning that, look, we're not going to force Spain or anybody else out of their colony. In fact, there are still colonies in the Caribbean today owned by European powers. But if that colony becomes independent and breaks away, you can't come back and reclaim it. So if, like, Venezuela becomes independent in this time period, which it did, once it's independent, once it becomes a republic and free of your colonialism, America is going to protect it. So it's basically a big warning that, hey, if you do this, if you try to come reclaim a territory, Spain or whoever, we're going to protect it. We're going to defend it no matter what. And we knew that basically Britain would back us up on this because Britain does not want to see anybody else establish himself as influential. While they're kind of pissed at us by doing this, Britain does back us up and helps us enforce this at the time because our Navy's not great. It's not the best Navy in the world, but Britain does back us up on this, again, kind of against their wishes. So the legacy of the Monroe Doctrine. It was very much applauded at the time, but it was soon forgotten. It was not a big deal at the time. We don't really expand and have a big dominance in the Western Hemisphere until the late 1800s, so in the industrial era. So it was very much liked at the time, but it is not a big deal at the time. It doesn't really become a bigger deal until later on in the later 1800s. Europeans were mad we went on this alone without their permission, but they knew the British Navy would protect it, which they did. It also will hold more significance in later decades when we also begin to go beyond our borders and begin to protect the Western Hemisphere and actually go into places like Hawaii and over to Asia and so forth and so on. In fact, future President James K. Polk, Polk spelled P-O-L-K, in the 1840s will use this idea, the Monroe Doctrine, to justify our expansion westward in general, like all the Manifest Destiny stuff, when we start expand ourselves westward to help protect the Americas in general. So the Monroe Doctrine overall helps to support our dominance of the Western Hemisphere, North, Central, South America, all the Caribbean. We're the dominant power then, we're the dominant power now, and we're going to remain that way for the foreseeable future. So that's how we're